Well, you may have noticed that for a lot of people in Canada today, as well as North America, the Canadian dream seems to be disappearing before our eyes, and specifically the middle class and the working class of this country seem to be in jeopardy. So I can't think of a better person to talk about why this is happening and what the solution is to turn this around. And that would be my friend, Professor Joel Kotkin, who is a professor of presidential appointment at Chapman University. He's also the director for the Center for Demographia at Chapman. And I'm just delighted to have Joel join us today.
Hi.
Welcome, Joel.
I guess what you're referring to. I mean, I've actually just been working on this, and in some senses, the Canadian problem is, in perhaps worse even than ours, which is quite an accomplishment. Um, the real problem is not so much by class, but by age. It's young people. In other words, working class Canadians. Some guy working at the UAW for the UAW in Toronto or in Ontario and has been there for 40 years, probably owns his own home, probably has a decent retirement. It's his son and his daughter who you have to worry about, and that's what's driving American politics. And I'm sure Canadians don't seem to be expressing this quite as strongly, but it down the road it causes all sorts of political problems as well.
But clearly, if you go to the grocery store, if you are a Canadian that is going about their day-to-day business, I mean, it is just stunning the amount of concerns people have about affordability. And in fact, there's a recent poll that just came out at the end of October by Abacus, and it said that two-thirds, Joel, of Canadians feel that they are in a precarious situation. They use the word precarity, but
Hmm.
two-thirds in the sense that, they're concerned about meeting their paycheck.
Right.
They're concerned about being able to afford more basic groceries, and let alone having their child grow up and be able to afford a home. Does that surprise you?
No, not at all. I mean, I think we've seen the same thing in the U.S. and, by the way, in the U.K. and Australia as well.
Okay.
And the biggest factor, although food prices are an issue, the big question is really the cost of housing and rents. That's where the vast majority, the difference in the cost of living, let's say, between Vancouver and someplace in Manitoba. The big difference isn't food, it isn't even electricity. By far, the biggest difference is housing.
Okay. So there's some key policy files we're going to walk through today to understand like what's really happening under the hood here, so to speak, and why the middle class and the working class are really being challenged in North America. But I thought you'd be a great person to talk to for many reasons, not the least of which is you wrote a fascinating book, a series of them about this topic, as well as the famous book Neo-Feudalism, kind of a warning to Western civilization. So tell us more about that book. What do we mean by new neo-feudalism?
Well, what I really talk about in that book, and I think it's borne out fairly decently, actually, is that essentially we've gone into a phase of economic development that is feudal in the sense of enormous amount of power and wealth concentrated in a few hands, the ownership of real estate by fewer and fewer people, um, and the growth of, at the same time, an expanding class that I sort of call the new serfs, people who will never own anything, who are really going to be dependent on, what Marx called the proletarian alms bag. You have that group, and the group in the middle continues to shrink because the power and wealth is concentrated. They really make it very difficult for anybody else to get anywhere. Capital comes in. One of the things that happens now is capital comes into a part of a major city, and all of a sudden the prices are 20, 30% higher. Or you have a big bank buying the remaining single family homes in suburban neighborhood, and all of a sudden, A, there's no supply, and B, the prices have gone up.
Wow. So this is profound in the sense that it's almost like history is going to repeat itself, where, for many societies, it's the few that dominate society, and a lot of people are either slaves or serfs, as you say. So, I mean, this is very concerning because why does this matter to us as citizens? I mean, it seems to me that everything's kind of at stake here if we kind of keep going down this path.
Well, I mean, look, there are several different things that are going on. One big thing is that uh, we're having a demographic meltdown, basically, because young people, they've been influenced by a kind of somewhat diseased culture. Um, they've been educated in a somewhat diseased education system, and then they come out and they even if they want to get married and have children and buy a house, they can't do it. And so what you find is some people in the U.S. I wrote about this that there are some people who do what Americans and Canadians have always done. Like my wife's family, Montreal became difficult for them. They all went to Toronto. People move. I moved from New York to California in the early 70s. It was a very good move, I have to say. Um, but I think what's happening now is that there's a population that feels it can't move or it doesn't want to move. So if you look at who the Mandami voters were in New York, they were not New Yorkers in the sense of they were people who had been there less than 10 years. The native New Yorkers, particularly those born in the city, my brother was born in the city. I was born in Heidelberg, Germany, because my father was in the army. But I would consider myself a native-born New Yorker. Those people voted for Cuomo, but you've got this young group. They come in, they go to college. They get told, oh, if you get your BA from Harvard or from NYU, your life is going to be great. You're going to do creative, wonderful stuff. Um, of course, you're deeply in debt, probably. You get out, and it turns out that your degree, well, as we used to say in New York, that and the subway token will get you a ride on the subway. I mean, it's like it doesn't, So here they are. They've got these fancy degrees. They really can't find work that can support a decent lifestyle in New York, which is quite a bit of money. You have to be earning at least six figures to even think about it. And they're looking at the state, i.e., Mandami and the city of New York, to freeze their rents, to give them free child care, and it looks like the free buses got shot down already by Governor Hochul, but you're going to put all these programs in, and that's somehow going to solve your problem.
Mhm.
I don't think that's going to happen. I think what we're going to find is probably in 4 years, New Yorkers will realize that they made a mistake and they'll put in somebody else. But in the meantime, there's damage. Plus, big cities, and particularly New York as an example, are already troubled and already have all sorts of very serious challenges. And then you add a utopian vision, which, by the way, and this is something I find interesting with the progressives in general, there's no program of economic growth. I mean, even
None.
Stalin understood that you could never improve the life of the Soviet people without some increase in production. Swedish socialism was based on a great export economy. Now, there are some very negative things about how they did it, but the reality is that their goal was to make middle and working class people able to buy a house, to have children. This is not the goal of today's progressives. Actually, many of them don't even believe in marriage, and the greener they are, the less they want children. And of
Well,
course,
it's stunning. It's almost like we're facing certainly in Canada, the middle class and working class, a perfect storm of different variables. And it's so serious that I'll never forget last April, a fascinating report came out from the federal government itself. And I think it was called Disruptions on the Horizon. And it is really a remarkable document. It kind of goes through almost a realistic set of variables looking to the future and cautioning that this could result in a lot of risks and a kind of a dystopian vision. And frankly, it reminded me a lot of your book, Joel, because it basically talked about different scenarios, including the fact where a few were in charge, and really the middle and working classes really don't have a democratic voice. So this is profound scenarios that you're talking about here, Joel.
Well, and of course you have, domination of the media, domination of the universities for of a certain ideology. So that makes it more difficult. The voter turnouts in many cases are very low, although they were quite high in New York. But the primary system in the U.S. means that you get increasingly radical people, winning in the primaries. Um, and I think fundamentally, power increasingly devolves to either government and a handful of companies. I mean, if you look at these companies that have $5 trillion values, which is just insane. They have so much money, and they have so much power. And people say, well, Trump got in, and that would be the end of it. No, Trump is part of it too. These forces are bigger than any politician, any country. You know, Amazon has a bigger net worth than like Spain and Mexico. I mean, these.
Remarkable.
I
Yeah.
mean, and so we have this enormously distorted picture where these private interests have tremendous control, and of course they exercise it through nonprofits. They bring money in, and then the other factor, which I think you have, particularly in Canada, though here too, but even more in Canada, you can't have a massive wave of immigrants coming into a country. 1 million immigrants in a country of 40 million
Mhm.
seems a bit much when you have a stagnant economy and high housing prices. By the way, same thing in the UK. You go to the UK, they've had enormous immigration, percentage-wise more than the US, as Canada as well. And what you're doing is you're bringing in all these people. You're not building the Trans-Canadian Highway or the or the railroad. You don't have any place to put these people except they go into Montreal and Toronto and they compete with each other and they compete with Canadians, and of course they compete for space. Now, look, I think immigration is a great thing and a great thing for Canada and for America. But we have to be careful who we have, and also to understand that we have. This is something I found shocking in Canada and the US and the UK and all through Europe. Enormous numbers of young people who are not engaged in the workforce, not in school.
Yes.
It,
Indeed, yeah. Well, in Canada, we now have record levels of youth unemployment
right.
where
I,
people are just simply not able to get their first job. And we find many are occupied, if we look at fast food restaurants across the country, they're usually temporary worker visas. It's really a remarkable phenomenon.
and of course, these jobs, you can say, well, they're mixed jobs or something like that. But this is my first job was like at a pizza parlor. My second job was at a ice cream place. I eventually moved up to a deli. But the reality is these were the jobs when you used to go to, Jack in the Box or
Yeah.
any chain, Hortons, you know the person behind the counter, if they were over 25, you were shocked. And very often they were a kid from a working class family. They were helping the family, or
Yeah.
they said, well, if you want to, like as my parents said, you want to go to Europe next year, work for a caterer for a year, which I did for
Mhm.
every weekend I worked for a caterer. These habits of life are being stripped away. Um, why shouldn't young Canadians of any ethnicity go and work at a local restaurant or shop and get some
Absolutely.
experience?
Yeah, they're critical jobs. And I think you're onto something, Joel. They impact our culture. If you are just simply at home and you're not engaged in society, you can't move forward. And I think that undermines and explains some of the public opinion data from younger people that there's a lot of discouragement and even anger that they can't seem to move ahead. So if you can't move ahead, wouldn't that explain why there's a whole segment of younger people that are turning to backward answers like socialism. Wouldn't that explain that?
Yeah, and I would make this argument because, as you know, I'm not a conservative. It's not socialism even as we would have expected. Let's say Mitterrand in France,
Yes. Yeah.
or even even to some extent, Tony Blair or somebody like that. It
Mhm.
it's social democracy that they favor. When you look at the DSA program, it is Marxist Leninist. You ask, when you ask them what societies do you want to be like, they're not saying, oh, we want to be like Sweden or Denmark. No, we
Okay.
want to be like Cuba. Their heroes are largely third world dictators. Given that I guess white males lost relevance after Stalin died, I suppose. But the reality is that this is a very hard vision. Social socialists in the past in the Western countries didn't talk about nationalizing the means of production. They knew it didn't work the first time, so why do it again? People say public housing. We need more public housing. Well, public housing has been an unbelievable disaster almost everywhere,
Right.
and so but you go back to these same failed policies over and over again, and what's astounding to me is, and this is another part, and I find this, frankly, because I teach, it's maddening. They don't know anything. I mean,
Mm.
I taught a class on propaganda, and one of the two of the classes were about socialism, because I talked about how Christianity rose, how National Socialism rose, how socialism rose. So I start off with a picture of Lenin. 35 kids in the class. One knew who it was, and he
One.
was an Armenian kid who grew up in Moscow.
Wow.
I mean, it's as if huge parts of history have just been erased. And
Okay. But let's just probe a little bit here. So we've talked about a number of policy areas, and one of which surely is education. If
right.
you have an education system that isn't teaching vigorously the ABCs, including mathematics and what is it again? Oh, yeah, history, then this is what you end up with in Joel's class, where only one child, young adult, knows about Lenin. I mean, that's pathetic, isn't it?
Oh, and it's about you see it in a lot of things, and at Chapman we have probably considerably better than average students. So, you know, I
Mhm.
mean, everybody I know who teaches has the same problem. Um,
Mhm.
if they're in high school, they're dealing with the deficits that they're coming in with. If they're in college, the deficits they brought from high school. Plus, there's a dangerous thing, and it's true in Canada and in the UK. Teachers, when I was growing up, public school teachers were, yeah, I mean, they tended to be more liberal than conservative, but there were lots of conservative, and by the way, many male teachers as well. Increasingly, you now have overwhelmingly female teachers, and the teachers unions have become the tip of the spear of the far left. So,
Interesting.
like we see
Yeah.
in places like Oakland, where they're
Mhm.
pushing, essentially pro Hamas propaganda. I know it's happened in Canada as well.
Mhm.
And then you
Okay.
get to the university level, and you would imagine that a large part of the faculty thinks that if you could bring back you know a communist regime or a Marxist Leninist regime, that we should. And so the teachers unions are pushing it, the public employees are pushing it. So what used to be liberal institutions have become radical institutions, and that's particularly
Okay.
scary.
All right, so that's another key variable is it's being what's taught in many institutions, including education, where parents want to have the trust that their children are getting skills and moving forward in terms of their education. But a big part of it is actually indoctrination into very radical ideologies. And I think this is something that's hard to fully understand until you have a child experience it. So that's why
Well,
you have diversity, equity, inclusion mantras all the time. Is that what you're referring to,
well,
Joel?
that's certainly part of it. How kids are taught. I remember two students I had were, well, it was a class I was, and I had somebody coming in lecturing. I do a lot of work on Hispanics and Asians and the people coming into the country, and just did a study for the University of Texas on this. And one of the things that I found amazing is that I said, well, what do you guys think about DEI and the training you got on these issues? And they were so resentful that they felt that they were being told that if they were white, they were racist. But the two that I remember, two amazing young women, one of whom was a philosophy major, super smart kids, and she, I think it was English father, Puerto Rican mother, and the other one was Korean and an American, a native born American, and they said, we don't think our dads are racist. They were telling me that my dad was a racist just because he was white. I mean, it was basically saying you were born with this mark of Cain and you're never going to get rid of it. And you're going to spend
Wow.
your whole life sort of genuflecting and hoping that maybe you get some sort of validation from somebody from the woke community to tell you. So you can imagine how this shapes how people, when they're growing up, they're they're being shaped by these ideologies, and of course they're also not given a great sense of what an amazing. And yes, there in America. Of course, we had slavery. Canada did not, to its honor, um, but you had the problems as with native with the first peoples, and we would call Native Americans. Um, and yes, there were bad things that happened, but think about the millions of people whose lives were incredibly improved by having Canada there. Just like, when my wife's family, after World War II, those who survived, they went to Canada and they built a nice life for themselves in
Mhm.
Montreal. We have lots of cases. My family, if we had stayed in the part of Russia that we're from, I wouldn't exist. I mean, that's as simple as that. There are so many people coming from poverty. You think about people, we forget that Scandinavia, which is a big source of immigrants, for instance, to the plain states and provinces, um, those people were poor. They were dirt poor. I mean,
Indeed.
they
Yes.
people don't get on a boat and spend months at sea in the North Atlantic if they're happy where they are. Uh,
Exactly. No, it's a remarkable story, and we should be really, frankly, celebrating and recognizing how, our societies gave birth to real prosperity and opportunity, and so that's why it's almost very concerning then to hear about our education system really kind of indoctrinate people in kind of these hateful ideologies. So I guess the question then is, what's the solution then when it comes to these education systems? What can we do to, frankly, break the public monopoly in so many areas? And I don't want to generalize because in Canada we have all kinds of different education systems, just like you have different ones in US states. But it's amazing. Just recently in Alberta, there was a massive teachers' strike. And it just begs the question, surely there's a better solution to this, Joel. So what is it?
well, in the book I'm working on now, and some of the work I'm also doing at Civitas, which is the think tank associated with the University of Texas. Um, Basically, I think the solutions are going to have to come from the ground up, and they're going to have to come locally. I think
Mm,
national institutions are, for the most part, broken, captured. In, but I do think that you can drive things like charter schools, school choice. Um,
yeah.
I am very much in favor of finding ways to expand, for instance, religious education, particularly. Again, if what you hope is the Catholic Church won't get too woke, but you know what? Kids who went to Catholic schools, or even I visited in the South Bronx a Catholic run charter, and those kids were doing great. It was, You were in the ultimate urban dystopia, and yet you went into those classrooms, and those kids had discipline. They were well dressed. They didn't talk back to their teachers. They showed up every day. I mean, I think that there's intrinsic strength in human beings, and we have to find out how to attract and develop that. And I think the great mistake of the the let's say the progressives today is they think all wisdom comes from above and they will tell us where to go. I think the intrinsic strength of people and the intrinsic thing that you want your children to do well. And what this is one of the things that I find so puzzling with the Mandami support is there's nothing he's going to do. My daughter is graduating. My younger daughter is graduating, 21 years old, and he's not doing anything that's going to make her life. And she's in New York, that makes her life better. He's not thinking about how do we, for instance, in the case of New York is losing control of the financial service sector. It's moving increasingly to Miami and to Dallas. Those are the two places, more than any place else. Don't you think that the mayor of New York should be concerned about losing that industry? Is the mayor of New York concerned about developing artisanal industries which might employ people in the inner city? Taking advantage of the fact that there's a big market there and people from all over the world with all sorts of different skills. There's no economic plan because I think part of it is, and I think this is a part that is a contributor, is just like Catholic ideology of the past held back to some extent Europe for a long time. I think green ideology is having an enormously bad effect. The reason that
Okay.
nobody talks the old social democratic language, which I speak, which is, in order to make things better for people, we need a stronger economy so that people will earn enough money so they can take care of themselves. That's sort of how do you get to that point? That's no longer the question because we don't want growth. Don't we think we'd be better off? Oh, you grew up in a four-bedroom house in the suburbs of Toronto, but your children should live essentially in cages near the urban core.
It's
I mean,
bizarre.
we're talking about just a complete lack of belief in in really upward mobility. I mean, upward mobility is the enemy, and this is deeply interesting. And of course, what really makes me particularly mad about that, this is financed by in many cases, the very wealthiest people in the world.
Bizarre.
If
So I think you've got a very important point here is that we've got to realize the interrelationship between all these variables. We need a strong economy, a strong culture. We've got to get those kids working in terms of good jobs and upward mobility. And they can't do that within a weak education system that just emphasizes these empty ideologies. So you mentioned a very interesting, it almost sounds like a religion today, which is green policies or green
right,
ideologies. What are you referring to? Like things like net zero and bicycle lanes and all kinds of other
well,
things?
I mean, net zero is sort of a policy that is going to be pretty much impossible to do unless there's a massive buildup of nuclear power, which even if it happens, it's going to take a long time, and a lot of the Greens will oppose it anyway. But I mean, it's a worldview. If you don't, for those people who need a religion to tell them this is right, this is wrong, every
Mhm.
step I make has to be towards this particular goal. It's very much like sort of a religious fanatic, who,
Mhm.
they forget the point that, remember, Freud once said, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Um, Sometimes things they're just normal things that human beings do. It's not some sort of indictment of their life and how they're destroying the planet. And of course, the cynicism that I have about some of this is, well, so your role model is China, which is pumping out the most GHG of any country, building more coal plants than solar, um, and yet we're not. We're not concerned with that. We're not concerned that Michael Bloomberg, who's one of the more fanatic green financiers, goes to Barbados every weekend on his private jet.
Hmm.
That's eating up more energy than you and I probably do in 10 years.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. So the hypocrisy is quite amazing. But Joel, that is a very interesting example because wouldn't the Bloombergs of the world represent that, well, that special class, the good and the great, who are kind of like, well, how do you say it, the royalty, the aristocracy of today,
aristocracy.
like they were back in medieval eras? They will go about and do their business, but we're beneath that. We're all there to serve them ultimately because they know what's best for us. Is that
Right.
part of the attitude that we're talking
I
about
think
then?
that's a lot of it, and these are. I mean, to make the more extreme case, you get the noble who goes into the village and says, "I have the right to have sex with your daughter before she gets married," um, and oh, I know it's wrong, and so he goes and gets absolution from the church. I mean, this is the kind of mentality. So you talk about neo-feudalism. I mean, it's pretty,
Wow.
it's pretty, shocking. I mean, this, again, as Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I
It
think that,
really does.
and
Wow.
and and
But
we're
okay, so let's just go further here. Let's go
sure.
back to the policy of immigration because it's fascinating. Both Canada and the United States have almost had a de facto open border
Yes.
when it comes to immigration. In Canada, we've experienced roughly 1 million new immigrants every year the last several years. And I could give you the stunning statistics, but it is shocking the numbers and also the change in composition of immigrants from more people that are self-sufficient and not dependent on the state to more and more people that are dependent on the state. And now, just recently, this last week, there's a motion coming forward um, from the government caucus actually saying there should be a amnesty for all the illegals within this country just to have a ready pathway to citizenship. So what the heck is going on here, Joel? Why would you flood the zone, so to speak? Why would you flood your country with um, frankly, all kinds of newcomers to Canada who then in turn use your healthcare system, education, everything in terms of supports? Why would we do that?
Well, I think, this is a reflection of an ideology in which basically the West is bad and it
Mm,
has to pay penance by letting, people in. Now, what's really shocking is we used to look at Canada as a role model for its immigration policy. It seemed to
yes,
me that,
indeed. Yeah,
and Australia was the same. You,
yeah.
what does Canada need? You know, does Canada need a 27-year-old person from South Asia who will go ring things up at McDonald's, which a job that a 20-year-old Canadian could have done very easily?
Hmm.
Does this person have some sort of special skill that the
Exactly.
country needs?
Yeah.
I mean, you think about, I know in the past with doctors in Canada that if you were an immigrant, you would be asked to go to a First Peoples area or to a small town where doctors were needed. You didn't need more doctors in Toronto.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
so I think that Canada had a very smart policy, and they brought in really, and it doesn't have to be somebody with a PhD. Frankly, I'd rather get a hardworking machinist than a postmodernist English professor. Um,
Yes.
I think we can. I think if Trump was smart, he'd have a postmodern English ban instead of a Muslim ban, because there are a lot of Muslims who are very hard workers and have great skills. I mean, so but I think that when we started to look at immigration as kind of an affirmative action, where we have to make up for the fact that we're Westerners and we've exploited and destroyed the world, um, and and instead of saying what is it that Canada needs, these young people who are having problems, they probably would benefit if let's say bright young Italian entrepreneur or a South African. I mean, like or Elon Musk for one. But if an entrepreneurial person moved to Canada, started a business, that was the trajectory they were on, or if they have a technical skill that Canada needs. But and then this notion, and I think frankly, David, a lot of libertarian economists have said, well, you need immigrants because they increase the GDP. Well, we know on a per capita basis, but all it's done is increase the number of people, but hasn't increased the income remotely at the same level. Same thing's true with the
Exactly. Yeah.
UK.
Right.
But Canada was such a success story, and so was
Mhm.
Australia, and they're both, going in the wrong direction.
It really is. Well, it's clear that the immigration file is important. We need immigrants, but how the file is managed is critical. And I think I'm wondering, Joel, though, is there another side to this that also explains this phenomenon of flooding our countries with newcomers? And that just has to do with politics. Is that the party in power sees a demographic that over time will, frankly, have a statistical propensity to vote for them? Is it
Well,
is
there's
it just
certainly,
simply
there's certainly
politics?
something like that. I mean, what I find particularly frightening has been this alliance of the left with the Islamists. That is a
Mm,
really dangerous thing. It's basically well come close to destroying what's left of France. It's doing the same thing in England, and now Canada is seeing some of the same things because
it
you know
really is
you
bizarre.
you,
Yeah.
you know you're importing people at a large level who are probably going to disrupt your system to a considerable extent. When my relatives came to the United States from Russia, they all my uncles served in the Second World War. They all they some of them could have been left of center, but they were patriotic Americans. They and
Indeed.
and and
Yes.
my wife's family, they were patriotic Canadians. And now that's not even an expectation anymore. Immigrant comes to a country, they sort of owe that country their loyalty and their adherence. That doesn't mean they have to support the current government, but they have to identify, I'm a Canadian. When I read some of these accounts, if I were a Canadian and I didn't know any better, I'd be ashamed to be a Canadian.
Hmm. But so, Joel, you're making a very insightful point that we really don't want hyphenated citizens. We want citizens who are their first and foremost loyalty is to being good citizens in our country. And I guess my question is, why should we like why does this matter to us as Canadians or Americans in the sense that people come in, they do what they want to do, but how does this really impact the economy? If I'm a business person, why should I even care about this issue?
Well, I mean, first of all, the question is, why did they come to the country? If they came to the country to work, then if you're a business person, you like people who work because not only do they do a job for you or for somebody else, but they also have some money of their own that they can buy your product. So you want people like that. You don't want people who are going to just claim your tax dollars, which is what you're
Exactly.
getting, and at the same time you're getting a whole series of ideologies imported that are against and I don't say this in any, and I am not 1/90th Anglo-Saxon, but I would say this: the Anglo-Saxon, British political tradition is what underpins our society. If you get rid of that, it's going to fall apart. And the
Okay.
great strength of England, and by the way, it was a strength of the Roman Empire, which is something I've done a lot of work on. Uh, you know, in the Roman Empire, they said it's for they tried to open to everyone. I mean, one of the reasons Rome succeeded in a way Greece didn't is Greece was very you had to be Greek. You couldn't come from someplace else and become a Greek. That was not possible. You could go to Rome and be accepted. Now you wouldn't maybe be accepted at the highest levels, but you were part of the mix that made Rome, the most astounding empire in history. Um, that's not the principle today. The principle is, we're going to we're not seeing our national heritage as a fundamental thing that binds us together. And I think
Hmm.
that's really and it's a terrible thing because I know enough history to know these people came, they didn't have anything. I mean, my wife will tell me about my father-in-law. um, uh, working with furs in Manhattan and in Montreal in a in the shed in the back in the middle of the winter with no heat. Okay,
Wow.
I mean, these were people who were determined. And I can tell you that whole crowd of kids that grew up in Montreal, almost all of them did extraordinarily well and
Oh, it's
contributed
amazing
enormously
stories.
to Canada.
Exactly. Yeah, no, what an incredible story. So we've talked a lot about key policies that are either, frankly, enabling, the disappearance of the middle class or the working class. But I want to talk about another key file that you've alluded to, and that is housing. And you know that very well,
Right.
housing affordability. Why is housing so darn expensive within different markets within North America? What's
Well, I
the
think
short
there.
answer to that?
Well, of course, as our friend Wendell Cox has pointed out, quite often,
Indeed.
it's not a crisis everywhere. It's not a real crisis in the middle of Canada. It's not a crisis in St. Louis. It's not a crisis in most of Texas. The because Texans do something. There's a demand, they build, and being Texans, they overbuild, and then the prices go down. I mean, I've watched the Texans for 30 years. I know how they operate. Um,
Yes.
I mean, the reality is that there are parts of the U.S. and parts of Canada which have very strict zoning policies. And but the idea is we're going to make everybody live in close to or in the middle of the city. So you're going to only build in the most expensive areas where it's the most expensive to build. And by the way, you're almost never going to build anything except for the very rich. You're not going to build anything more than a one bedroom apartment. People are not going to have children in a one bedroom apartment. They've grown up in a suburban house in the suburbs of Vancouver, and you're now telling them, well, if you want to stay in Vancouver, you have to live in 500 square feet. Well,
Yeah.
probably not. Or if I do, I'm not. Why should I work? And I'm certainly not going to get married and have kids. I mean, two people in 500 square feet is
Exactly. Yeah.
probably a good thing for homicidal tendencies. I mean, it's so what you've done is you've said the vast majority of Canadians, the vast majority of British, the vast majority of Australians, and the vast majority of Americans basically want a single family home, or at
Indeed.
very
Yeah.
least a townhouse that has some room. The Greens and the planners and the real estate speculators say, "Oh no, we're gonna make you live in a tiny space, make you pay a premium rent, so that you can exist in essentially a box." And
Yeah. No,
people don't want it.
it's
But if
crazy.
you if people want A and you only offer them B, then A becomes extraordinarily expensive. So like if you
Exactly.
want a single family house in the Vancouver or Toronto areas, you're paying higher prices than you are in the Bay Area. You're paying a higher price than you're paying in terms of income. You're paying a higher price than it is to live here in Orange County, which has a lot going for it. So you're telling people that they have to that if they want to live in one of these great big cities, they're going to have to live a second class life. What made cities like Toronto and Montreal and New York great is they had middle and working class neighborhoods where people raised their kids, educated their kids. They were part of the fabric. When we look at the voters now, like you look at New York and you see that you have an election dominated by people who haven't even been in the city for more than 10 years. Um, so, I think that we're talking about almost a transactional city where the city is just a kind of a physical geographical unit that you
Mm.
spend part of your life in. But it's not what you devote yourself to. It's not something that you feel you're part of the way, when I would, as a child growing up and driving with my father, who was a real New Yorker, and we'd be driving along the Brooklyn Queens Expressway and looking at Manhattan. He said this was the yellow brick road. This was a Valhalla for immigrants, whether they came from Poland or Russia or
Yeah.
Italy or Ireland. It was a place of magic, and we've sort of lost that. And our cities are becoming, you know, basically they have rich people, poor people who are dependent, um, and a bunch of young people who are there most likely for a short period of time who are going to be permanent renters, and that's
Wow.
that's what you have. And what's missing are those middle working class, neighborhoods where often people owned their own home, had a business, raised their families, went to church. That's just disappeared.
Well, I want to talk about another key policy area, and that has to do with technology.
Mm.
And, we've heard a lot about, well, the outsourcing of jobs, technology jobs. Like I look at my iPhone and I'm embarrassed that, it's all made in China. I know it says a little bit, it says it's designed in California. But having said that, I mean, the phenomenon of so many jobs being outsourced, and I just look at that phenomenon, I think, man, those are very important jobs to build the middle and working class. What's your take on this? And
I think
what's
this
the
is one of
future
the
of AI?
well, I teach with a colleague a class on AI, so we've been looking a lot at that. The interesting thing about AI is that it's probably going to hit the very well educated harder than the manual workers, although it will hit eventually through robotics some of those jobs. But I think fundamentally what you see, we see this in California. We have and we in quote create a product, a new airplane that gets much better mileage, and they've got lots of orders. But they're going to build the plane in South Carolina. So there are 13,000 well-paying jobs that could have been in San Bernardino or someplace like that. That's gone. And obviously, there are many companies who just simply went to China as soon as they possibly could. And so we've essentially eliminated our ability to make things. Not just do we not make things, we don't even know how to make them. Like there was one story about when they wanted to bring some of an Apple product to Texas, they couldn't find anybody to make the screws small enough that would fit in. I mean, if we were, you look at this and you say, how did the United States of America win the Second World War on a
Exactly.
production basis? What did Canada have to offer to Great Britain to keep it alive? You know, those that ability to produce. I mean, we think about as David, you pointed out, we were talking about rare earths, which are critical to this technology industry, who are not as rare as people think they are. Canada's got a lot of them, the U.S. has a lot of them. But you know what? Our politicians will not allow us, our system will not allow us to do what we need to do. So the Chinese either do it at home or they go to the Congo and they don't care if 12-year-old kids are digging cobalt with their hands. What difference does it make to them? Nothing. So I think that it's like we're sort of surrendering our heritage on every single level, on technological level, on economic level, on the housing level, on the education level. It's all part of the same sort of retreat from the very things that made our countries great.
It's almost like our government, further to that point, is creating a morass of red tape where we just can't build things. We can't get things done, and we don't then have the people that are educated to actually build those widgets. I mean, I think that's true about World War II. I mean, we both have incredible histories of winning those big wars because we had the industrial might and the
Right.
know-how to get things done. It's almost like we have to realize the urgency of this to save our own societies against this kind of almost like a rot within. Is that what you're
Right.
getting at, Joel?
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate, and I think that I mean, look, I'm not a big Trump fan, but I think his election was at least a sign that people knew that if we keep going in the way we were going under Biden, we were finished. We were going to end up
Oh,
as a second tier economy. We were going to live in a world in which China basically ruled, and the only hope to oppose them would be India. Um, and I think our societies, North America has the best piece of real estate on the planet. We have enormous resources. We have lots of land.
indeed.
Um, we have we have major rivers. We have a still a talented population. Still, where people want to go. People say, "Oh, the brain drain." I just finished a piece on it. There's no brain drain. The people are still trying to get into the U.S. and Canada if you got your degree from IIT, well, like Santa Clara looks pretty good, Toronto looks pretty good, um, you know, and I think we forget that what our appeal is, and what North America has a unique position in the world. Where we do have the two oceans, we do have enormous resources, we have gorgeous topography, we have tremendous variety, um, and we're a culture. I mean, to me, having an American culture which says, I don't really care where your grandparents came from. Um, we don't live in that kind of world anymore. We live in a world where, we have no problem with somebody whose grandparents came from Poland and 70 years ago or 100 years ago. We don't think of them as being any different than any other American.
Mhm.
And similarly, I mean, again, working a lot on Hispanics in this most recent report, we found that Hispanics were the most opposed to defunding the police of any ethnic group, the group most likely to join the police force and the military.
Isn't
That
that something? Wow.
and
But
that so
what a
we have
remarkable
something to
vision
build on.
that but that's a remarkable vision that our countries share, is that you can come from anywhere in the world and you can live the Canadian, the American dream, as we're talking about. So what's the bottom line here? We've got a lot of challenges so we don't become these neo-feudalistic societies like they did in old. But how do we turn this around? What's the bottom line here? Is it just like do the opposite of what we've talked about here?
Yeah, the bottom line, I think, is to come up with a way of reviving our capitalist system so that it serves the interests of the middle and working class, not just the very big investor class. Now,
Yes.
if that involves some policies that some libertarians may not like, though that's their problem. Um,
Mhm.
we need to be able to focus on an education system that teaches both the very high concepts, but also for many kids the tactile skills. We in America we got rid of our shop classes, and so people don't even
Crazy.
know how to work with their hands. You
Yeah.
know, I mean we have to have a different mentality about how we approach things so that we say we're in a competitive world. What is it that makes America competitive with China? There's this theory that, well, we'll be the brilliant, creative types, and China will do all the work. The Chinese aren't stupid. They're going to say, I'm
No.
doing all the work. I'm going to do all the creating too. You know,
Mhm.
people are not going to accept this servile position. But there's large parts of our financial community who just, okay, I'll put a bunch of money in, I'll make a bunch of money. The fact that
Mhm.
I wipe out an entire community in Ontario, I wipe out an entire community in the American Midwest. They could care less.
Mhm. Well, I think you're onto something here, Joel. And I think your book about neo-feudalism is truly a warning to all the global middle classes, a wake-up call. So we've got lots of work to do. So, Joel, I want to thank you for joining us for today's far-reaching conversation.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and again, just to despite the behavior of our president, I think Canada is our natural partner, and that we should do everything we can to work with Canadians as much as possible.
You
And we
bet.
do it in this
Let's do it
household.
together. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Joel, and it's been great to see you.
Nice to see you. Thank you.
Here at Frontier, we don't receive any government funding. We are nonpartisan and we work for you. Find out more and support this important work by visiting fcpp.org today. Thank you so much for watching this recent episode. We love your comments and we'd like to hear more from you. If you haven't, make sure you press this bell and subscribe to this channel. Check everything out. We'd love to hear more about your comments.